Arnhem, the Netherlands. September 21st, 1944. A young paratrooper presses himself flat against the rubble of a shattered terrace house, ears ringing, mouth dry with brick dust. 50 meters away, the unmistakable grinding clatter of a German Tiger tank's tracks grows louder by the second. He has no anti-tank gun. He has no bazooka, no rocket launcher, nothing that resembles the sleek weapons carried by his American allies. What he has is a green metal tube roughly the size of a drainpipe, fitted with a stock, a trigger, and a spring inside it thick enough to suspend a small car. It looks faintly absurd, more like something a plumber might wield than a soldier. He hauls it onto his shoulder, slides a bomb the shape of a stubby pineapple into the cup at the front, and waits. There is no backblast to give away his position, no rocket motor to ignite, nothing but the violent mechanical snap of a spring releasing and a small explosive charge punching the projectile forward. The Tiger rounds the corner. He fires. That weapon was the Piat, the projector, infantry, anti-tank, and for all its clumsy looks and brutal recoil, it became one of the most quietly important pieces of equipment fielded by British and Commonwealth forces in the Second World War. It killed tanks. It killed bunkers. It won at least one Victoria Cross outright, and it was, by the admission of the men who carried it, one of the most physically punishing weapons ever issued to an infantryman. This is the story of why Britain built something that looked like a piece of garden equipment, why it had to, and how it ended up stopping armored divisions cold on battlefields from Sicily to the Reichswald. Why does this matter? Because the Piat represents something larger than one ugly weapon. It represents the desperate ingenuity of an army that, for the first half of the war, simply could not match its enemies tank for tank, and had to find another way to even the odds. To understand why the Piat existed at all, you have to go back to the catastrophic state of British anti-tank capability in the years immediately following Dunkirk. In the summer of 1940, the British Army had left the bulk of its heavy equipment scattered across the beaches and fields of northern France. Anti-tank guns, lorries, artillery pieces, all abandoned or destroyed. What remained at home to defend against an expected German invasion was, in places, almost nothing at all. The standard infantry anti-tank weapon of the period, the boys' anti-tank rifle, was already showing its age. It fired a heavy 14.5mm round that could, in the right circumstances, punch through the thin armor of early war light tanks and armored cars. But German tank armor was thickening fast, and the boys' rifle's penetration simply could not keep pace. Worse, the weapon weighed over 16 kilograms, kicked like an angry mule, and was nearly impossible to use effectively from a prone firing position without dislocating something. By 1941 and into 1942, the gap had become a chasm. German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, and later the fearsome Tiger and Panther designs, carried armor that made the boys' rifle little more than an irritant. British infantry, facing armor in the desert campaigns of North Africa and later in the bitter fighting in Italy, found themselves with shockingly few options. They could call for artillery support, which was not always available or timely. They could rely on towed anti-tank guns, which were heavy, difficult to maneuver, and frequently outranged or outflanked. Or they could improvise, throwing sticky bombs, Molotov cocktails, and No. 75 Hawkins grenades under tracks in acts of near-suicidal close-quarters bravery. The statistics from these engagements make for grim reading. Entire infantry positions were overrun simply because the men holding them had no reliable means of stopping armor at any reasonable distance. The problem was not a lack of courage. It was a lack of equipment that matched the threat. What the Army needed was something a single infantryman could carry, something that did not require a crew of 4 and a towing vehicle, something that could be fired from a foxhole or ruined building and still put a hole through several inches of hardened steel. It needed to be light enough to lug across muddy fields and up staircases, simple enough for a conscript to learn in an afternoon, and powerful enough to matter. On paper, this sounded almost impossible, Conventional anti-tank guns achieved penetration through sheer velocity, hurling a solid shot fast enough to punch through armor by brute force, and that demanded long barrels, heavy recoil systems, and substantial weight, none of which suited a man on foot. Something genuinely different was required. The answer came from an unlikely combination of an eccentric inventor and a piece of physics that had, until then, mostly been associated with mining and demolition work. Major Millis Jefferies, working with the military intelligence research establishment known as MD1, based at a requisitioned country house called The Firs near Whitchurch in Buckinghamshire, had already built a reputation for unconventional weaponry. MD1 was sometimes nicknamed Churchill's Toy Shop, a small and fiercely secretive design unit that answered more or less directly to the Prime Minister's office and was given remarkable latitude to pursue ideas that more conservative ordnance boards might have rejected outright. It was here that the PIAT took shape, drawing heavily on the work of another engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Blacker, who had already experimented with spigot mortar systems, weapons that dispensed with a conventional barrel entirely. The genius, and the part that made the weapon look so peculiar, lay in how it launched its bomb. Rather than using a barrel and propellant charge to push a shell down a tube, the PIAT used what is known as a spigot mortar system. Inside the body of the weapon sat a steel rod, the spigot, driven forward by an enormous coiled spring under significant tension, similar in principle to the recoil spring inside a heavy-duty industrial machine, but considerably stronger. When the trigger was pulled, the spring drove the spigot forward into the tail of the bomb sitting in the cup at the muzzle end. That impact ignited a small propellant cartridge built into the base of the bomb itself, which provided the actual thrust to send the projectile toward its target, while simultaneously driving the spigot backward again, recocking the spring for the next shot, at least in theory. This arrangement solved two problems at once. First, because the propulsion charge was tiny and contained almost entirely within the bomb, there was no significant muzzle flash and no telltale backblast, the visible jet of exhaust gas that gave away the position of rocket-propelled weapons like the American bazooka or the German Panzer Schreck. A PIAT gunner firing from inside a building or a thick hedgerow did not risk setting fire to curtains behind him or revealing his position to every German soldier within 200 meters. Second, the bomb itself carried a hollow charge warhead, the same shaped charge principle used in contemporary anti-tank grenades, which focused the explosive force of the warhead into a narrow, high-velocity jet capable of burning through armor many times thicker than a conventional shell of similar size could manage. The PIAT's bomb, weighing around 1.1 kilograms and roughly the size and shape of a large pineapple, could penetrate around 100 millimeters of armor, enough to deal with the side and rear armor of most German tanks, and in the right circumstances, even frontal armor on lighter vehicles. The weapon itself was not elegant. It weighed approximately 14.5 kilograms, nearly a stone heavier than the American bazooka, and measured just under a meter in length. Cocking it for the first shot required the firer to stand the weapon on its butt, place both feet on the body, and haul back on the barrel section with both hands against spring tension, roughly equivalent to compressing the suspension of a small lorry, a task that left many soldiers cursing and a fair few with strained backs. The recoil on firing was notoriously brutal, a vicious thump against the shoulder that soldiers compared to being kicked by a horse. Manufacturing took place at various engineering works across Britain, including facilities associated with the broader small arms production network, with components produced under wartime dispersal arrangements to reduce the risk of bombing disrupting output. Exact production figures remain somewhat uncertain due to the compartmentalized nature of wartime manufacturing records, but estimates suggest that well over 115,000 units were produced before the war's end, making it one of the more widely issued infantry anti-tank weapons in British and Commonwealth service. In the field, the PIAT proved its worth in conditions that played to its peculiar strengths: short range, urban combat, ambush, and defense. At Arnhem, during Operation Market Garden in September 1944, lightly armed British paratroopers found themselves facing German armor with little else available, and Piats accounted for a significant number of confirmed tank and self-propelled gun kills during the battle, often fired from desperately close range inside shattered houses and gardens. It was during this same campaign that Lance Sergeant John Baskyfield of the 2nd Battalion, the South Staffordshire Regiment, used a PIAT to destroy 2 tanks and damage a third near Oosterbeek, continuing to fight after being wounded until he was killed manning his weapon alone, an action for which he was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross. Earlier, in Sicily in 1943, and later in the Italian campaign and during the fighting in Normandy and the Low Countries, PIAT teams ambushed German armor from hedgerows, ruined buildings, and sunken lanes, exploiting the weapon's silent launch to strike before the target crew even realized infantry were nearby. Records of individual engagements are patchy, kept where unit war diaries survived and where officers thought to note specific kills, and historians today rely heavily on these scattered accounts rather than any comprehensive central tally. But the psychological effect on German tank crews, suddenly vulnerable to enemy infantry they could not see or hear coming, appears in numerous post-war accounts as a genuine and significant factor. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Set against its contemporaries, the PIAT occupied an odd middle ground. The American bazooka, formerly the M9, used a rocket-propelled projectile fired from an open tube, lighter at around 6 kilograms unloaded and far more pleasant to fire, but its rocket motor produced a visible backblast and a telltale signature flash that frequently exposed the gunner's position, a serious liability in defensive fighting. The German equivalent, the Panzerschreck, was a similarly rocket-based system, larger and more powerful than the bazooka with penetration figures exceeding both British and American designs, but it required the firer to wear a protective mask or cape against the rocket exhaust and, like its American cousin, gave away its position with every shot. The simpler German Panzerfaust, a disposable, recoilless weapon, was cheap, light, and devastatingly effective at extremely close range, but its effective range rarely exceeded 30 meters, and it could only be fired once before discarding. The PIAT's particular advantage was the combination of no visible launch signature with reusability, a quality neither the bazooka nor the Panzerschreck could fully claim, since both betrayed their firer's location each time they were used. For ambush warfare, for ruined towns and thick bocage country, this mattered enormously. Its disadvantages were equally real: the punishing weight, the brutal effort required to cock it, a maximum effective range against moving targets of perhaps 100 meters compared to the bazooka's somewhat longer reach, and a worrying tendency for the firing mechanism to malfunction if the spring lost tension or became fouled with mud, occasionally forcing soldiers to manually strike the firing pin with a mallet or rifle butt in the field, an emergency fix that became something of grim soldierly folklore. No major army copied the PIAT's spigot mortar design outright for infantry anti-tank use, though the broader spigot mortar principle would echo forward into later British weapons, including some experimental and demolition systems developed after the war. Assessing the PIAT's true historical impact requires some honesty about the limits of the record. It was never a weapon that soldiers loved, and complaints about its weight and the agony of cocking it appear constantly in memoirs and oral histories. Yet its material impact, measured in tanks and strongpoints destroyed, was genuinely significant, particularly in the close, broken terrain of Normandy's bocage and the urban fighting of Arnhem, Caen, and later the Rhineland battles, where its silent launch gave infantry a fighting chance against armor that would otherwise have rolled over them unopposed. Its psychological impact may, in places, have exceeded its material one. German tank crews operating in built-up areas had to assume that any doorway or rubble pile might conceal a PIAT team, a fear that slowed advances and encouraged caution that occasionally proved decisive in its own right, though quantifying that effect with any precision remains beyond what the surviving records allow. The weapon's influence on later anti-tank design was modest compared to the rocket-propelled systems that would dominate post-war development, but it remained in limited Commonwealth service into the early 1950s, including use during the Korean War, a testament to its continued usefulness even as more modern systems emerged. Surviving examples can be seen today in collections including the Imperial War Museum in London, the Tank Museum at Bovington, and numerous regimental and Commonwealth military museums, where visitors can appreciate firsthand just how unwieldy and strange the thing actually was to handle. Return for a moment to that paratrooper at Arnhem, shoulder against the cold metal tube, watching a Tiger tank round the corner of a Dutch street. He did not have the sleek rocket launcher his American counterparts carried. He had a spring, a steel rod, and a bomb shaped like a pineapple, built by an eccentric inventor's secret workshop in a country house outside London.